Hello and welcome back to my channel, or welcome for the first time if you're new around here. If you are new, my name's Vivian Asimos and I'm writing a book all about cosplay, and this is the series called Fieldwork Reflections, where I am reflecting on my fieldwork. So basically what I'm doing is I'm going through the different by themes, some of the different topics and ideas and conversations that I've had with cosplayers over the last year or so. And I'm kind of talking about what people had to say. I'm using their exact words, the exact conversations that I had. And then I'm ending with a little bit of my analysis to give you kind of a brief idea of some of the stuff that is coming up and some of the stuff that I'm thinking about. Today's topic. Today's topic I get is gonna be a big one because we're talking about gender today. Now, there are a couple of different ways we're going to talk about gender in relation to cosplay. So, I'm breaking this up into 3 different ways that cosplay and gender interact, for lack of a better term, because obviously gender is always there, but how it specifically comes up and how it specifically affects cosplay or cosplayers. So we can talk about how the gender of the cosplayer affects the character. We can talk about how the gender of the character affects the cosplayer, and we can talk about how there's absolutely no shifting or changing or affecting in any way, shape, or form. So I thought that we would start with actually the third one. Now, this third one I'm kind of calling no effect but coexistence, which I don't know is that the right idea, because it's not like the other people or the other options are at odds with one another. They're not like warring or anything like that. But it's just a different perspective on it. And primarily in this section, we're talking about people who do what is often called crossplays, which is when somebody of one gender is playing a character in another gender without changing the character's gender or their own, which is a lot more effort than the first one. But there's no alteration or change of identities involved in either the character or the cosplayer side. It's just say a woman cosplaying a male character or a male character cosplaying a female character, and that's it. Now, the term crossplay is a controversial one. Some people were using it freely and no problems at all, and I had some people telling me that they find it a problematic term. I don't want to offend anybody, so for the time being, I'm using the term drag cosplays instead, which isn't perfect because drag is very different than cosplay, but also has a lot of similarities with it. That's a conversation for another time. But I use the term drag simply to communicate the idea that it is one gender embodying another gender without shift of identities on either side. Now, some people do this a lot. Some people drag cosplay all the time. Stevie, for example, is somebody who identifies as female, who has cosplayed a lot of male characters. They say that it's kind of just happenstance. They kind of just happened to always be cosplaying male characters. But they also feel a lot more comfortable cosplaying male characters. They find that female characters tend to be very overly sexualized, and it makes them uncomfortable embodying that character because then that is kind of put onto them. So they prefer the male characters. They say they also try not to cosplay male characters that are very overly sexualized also. So it's not just a female thing. Sam talked about how they really enjoy doing drag cosplays. They kind of convince other people that they know to do drag cosplays. They really enjoy it. Now, Sam identifies as non-binary. I talked to quite a few non-binary cosplayers, and for a lot of non-binary cosplayers, basically every cosplay is some type of drag cosplay, because there's not exactly like a load of non-binary characters out in popular culture to grab onto. So the vast majority of the cosplays that they end up doing are, in some essence, a drag cosplay. And that was kind of how it was communicated for most of the non-binary cosplayers that I talked to. They talked about how they tend to embody characters regardless, and how everything is always, in essence, some type of drag cosplay, because that just be how, unfortunately, it is without a lot of non-binary representation. So let's get into one of the other bits, and let's talk about when gender affects the character. So in this time, we're talking about the gender of the cosplayer is having an impact on the way the character is being presented. This is often called gender bending. So if I identify as female, if I wanted to cosplay a male character instead of doing a drag cosplay where I am embodying being male, I will change that character to present them as female to match my gender. That is typically how it is done. Most gender bending is that the character is being shifted to fit the cosplayer's gender. I don't know if I've ever seen it where, say, a female character is embodying or a female cosplayer is embodying a female character that they make male. I haven't really seen that. I'm sure it exists. I would love to see it. If you have any of those, please tell me in the comments, because I would love to see those. But it's not something that I encountered very often. Most of the time, it was that the cosplayer's gender was what was on display as the gender, and the character was being shifted to fit that person's gender. Now, gender bending is a choice for cosplayers for a couple of different reasons, and it is very dependent on the cosplayer. So there were a couple of different reasons why people gender bent that I heard. One of them came from Elliot. Elliot identifies as female and said that they primarily do gender bending because that's just the body they have. They have a female body. It is a very obvious female body, and instead of trying to put in a load of effort to change their body just for the sake of a costume, they just put on a costume that fits their body, and that's what they are. So yeah, they said that it was just a natural gender bending because they're female, so any costume that they put on without trying to massively alter the way that their body is understood by people who are watching them is going to just be female. Riley was somebody who did a lot of different forms. So they sometimes did drag cosplays, sometimes they gender bent, sometimes they played it straight. That sounds wrong. Sometimes they didn't do any changes at all and they were matching the gender that they are. And there was a lot of different choices. And they said that the reasons why they sometimes gender bend, sometimes they don't, is simply due to the process of making the costume. They said that while they are in the process of making the costume, sometimes they'll feel like the costume just needs to go a certain way, or that the performance of the character just needs to go a certain way, and it's just the gut feeling that they have during the costume construction process. Grayson saw gender bending as a way of putting their own spin on the character, so they saw it as a creative input. This is my way of putting my own interpretation and my own ideas onto something that already exists. Almost like when people do like fan art of like their favorite characters. It's that, but in life rather than it's a type of fan art, I guess, that Grayson was doing. They were doing like their own fan art of a character by putting their own spin on it. There was another person who I spoke to who's non-binary, who instead of seeing that the costume was a drag cosplay in the way that Sam saw it, they saw it as that their body is not a binary body, and therefore any time that they put on a costume, it meant that that character became a non-binary character. Which I think is a really interesting perspective on the same conversation that Sam was having, right? That instead of saying, well, everything that I do is a drag cosplay because I have a non-binary body, it's kind of similar to what Elliot was saying, right? That Elliot, but from a female perspective of this is what my body is, and I have a female body, and therefore I just happen to gender bend because anytime I put on a costume, it's going to look female because I look female. And that's how this other non-binary cosplayer saw it, is that whenever they put on a costume onto their non-binary body, it meant that that character was a non-binary version of that character because they are non-binary. Which I thought was really fun, an interesting way of seeing how gender bending works. Let's talk about the third one now, which is when the character's gender impacts the cosplayer. Now, I did phrase that right. So we've talked about drag cosplays, we've talked about gender bending, we've talked about people who just kind of, you know, I'm a female when I go, my one cosplay is a female character, and that's, so it's just played a 1-to-1. So there's all of those kind of options. This conversation, I think, is both utterly fascinating and utterly beautiful. So basically what this is that a lot of people who I spoke to who are trans talked about how cosplay helps them transition. And I think that this is really wonderful. Basically, cosplay has given space for people to play with gender. I mean, we've talked about the variety of ways in which people have done that, right? So if I identify as female and I spend a lot of time wearing male costumes, like how Stevie does, then, you know, that is in some way allowing me to play with gender and gender representation on my own body without fear of repercussion, right? Now, we talked in a previous video on community about how that's not necessarily the case, that there is still a lot of transphobia in the cosplay community, but the act of cosplay gives you an excuse to play with gender in a way that might not be inherently present to people outside of cosplay. And this process can affect people like Stevie in the sense where it's just a nice fun time, or it can affect people in a different way, and it can make them learn a lot about their own bodies and their own selves and their own understanding of their own gender through the process of playing with it. So Mason was somebody who I spoke to who was trans. Mason talked to me about how cosplay helped them transition because of everything that I've just said. They talked about how it gave them the space to play with gender. It gave them the space to learn about how they felt about being perceived as different genders, because that's something that I can't remember if we talked about in that transphobia discussion, where if people are perceiving you as a male character, sometimes they'll use male pronouns. Or if you are dressed as a female character, sometimes they will use female pronouns. Very seldom do people use they, them, no matter what you're wearing. So basically they were saying that it allowed them to be a particular character, to be perceived as a different gender than they are typically being perceived as, and they learned a lot about themselves through that process. Arthur was another person who I talked to who's trans, and again talked to me about how cosplay allowed them to play with the ideas of femininity and masculinity, and learn a lot about how they felt about these ideas, and learned a lot about themselves in the process of playing like this. Arthur does identify as male, as transmasc, but is perfectly happy playing a lot of other characters, regardless of gender. Partly because of this, not everyone who was trans that I spoke to felt this way. Some of them were very uncomfortable with still being perceived and described using the wrong pronouns and being perceived as the wrong gender. And so that's not always the case for everybody. But I think that it's really wonderful that people have had this impact. Now, before I get a load of stupid ass comments from terrible people, I do not believe that cosplay makes people trans. It is simply a way that trans people who are already inherently trans can discover the fact that they are trans through the process. Because as I said, there are people like Stevie who wear male costumes all the time and still identifies as female. That doesn't make them trans. However, the process of playing with gender can allow people to learn a lot about themselves, whether it is solidifying the fact that they are cis, or whether it's discovering that maybe they aren't. I think this helps us to lead into our analysis, because gender is a socialized construct. In case you didn't already know, I think to talk about this more specifically, I am going to rely on feminist scholar Judith Butler. Judith Butler had an idea of performativity. Now, what Judith Butler's idea was, in a nutshell, is that we grow up learning our various categories, right? We grow up learning what things are from the society and the people around us. It's our parents that teach us what something is. It's our other units in our societal group. So if you are somebody who goes to church, your pastor. Other adults in positions of power and authority over children teach children about the structures of the world. And embedded within this is also the teaching of what gender is and how it is enacted. At no point is gender understood as something inherent. Rather, it is understood as a type of performance, right? We learn that girls wear skirts, boys do not wear skirts, for example, in some cultures. We learned that girls have long hair, boys do not have long hair. These are all really basic ideas that obviously, particularly with the man bun craze, can be different, but I'm just speculating here. So this is kind of the things that we learn. I remember growing up that I was told that I wasn't allowed to drink out of a glass bottle because I'm a lady, despite the fact that there were boys around me drinking out of glass bottles, but they're allowed to drink out of glass bottles because they're a man. See, these are the things we're talking about, those kinds of socialized idea of what a girl looks like and how a girl moves and how a girl acts that is not inherently part of them. It's the way that you socially perform. So basically, there is nothing inherently girl about the idea of girl. It's all something that is socially performed. And cosplay is the act of dressing as another character who has their own social performance of gender. So if I identify as female, I am born as female, people are ascribing female to me at birth, and I have become socialized to act in the way that female acts, and then suddenly I can dress like boy. And part of that dress like boy, as we've talked about in previous videos of this, is the performance of boy, right? It's not just enough to look like the character. I have to act like the character. As Bailey said, as I talked about in a different video, Bailey said you have to move like the character. So suddenly I get to act like boy. I get to move like boy. I get to learn all of those social constructions that we've learned that makes boy, I suddenly get to do. That's really cool. And in that process, I can learn that actually, inherently within me, I make more sense and I connect more and my body feels better when I'm enacting boy. Now, it is very seldom that people get the chance to mess about with gender in this way just normally in life. it's typically because of being involved in a particular process or action or performance. So it's because of cosplay, it's because you're in theater, it's because you go to a drag show, it's because you are doing something that inherently demonstrates to you what this is. Quick story anecdote time. When I was in high school, I was joining the Thespian Society because yes, I was that kind of nerd. And part of the joining was that you had to do a day where you dressed up as kind of an older, more senior member of the drama club. So the person who I was doing it as was somebody who was a man. Identified as male at the time. I haven't really seen them in a very long time, so I'm not going to assume. And I got to act like a dude for a day. And it was so strangely freeing. And now I'm a cis woman, and I know for a fact that I'm not trans, but the different experience of being able to socially live as another gender for just a day was so cool and so freeing and so amazing. And I can imagine how even more freeing and how even more amazing that would be when you are trans. To really feel for once like, oh, this is not a character. This is me. This is who I actually am as a person. So, basically, in a nutshell, gender is a social construct. The way that gender is understood and taught to us is something that is, in fact, all that. It is understood and taught to us. It is not something that is inherent. We do not have this inherent sense of girl, woman, or boy, man that is somehow embedded in us at some point in birth. We are taught to act our genders. And what cosplay does is it allows for that performativity all the time. If you're gender bending, you are also considering performativity, right? You're considering, okay, so here's this character who is typically understood as male, and I'm going to make them female. And so I have to think about, how does that change the character? Does it change the character? Do they change the way they dress? Do they change the way they act? Do they change the way they move? Because these are all parts of gender, of the learning, the socialized learning of gender. So how does that impact my performance of the character? This is also an understanding of performativity. So basically what cosplay does is it demonstrates to us innately, perfectly, and obviously that gender is a social construct, that gender is taught to us, that gender is performed socially every day. And what it does is it gives people a space to perform another gender. And that can be one day freeing, as it was for people like me, as it is for people like Stevie, or it can really have a massive, wonderful impact on their life to demonstrate to them who they actually are as a person. That's it for today. Thank you guys for joining me and talking about gender. A lot more can be said about gender, a lot more can be said about sexuality, a lot more can be said about a lot of things in cosplay, and hopefully I will be able to shove at least a couple more kernels of this before the series is up. Maybe I'll do like one or two kind of quick things when the book's about to come out. I don't know. I haven't decided yet. That's future Vivian's problem to figure out. If you enjoyed this, go and subscribe, like it, do all the YouTube things that people tell you to do that I can't think of at the moment. Go subscribe, like this video, make a comment in the description below. Have you seen really interesting perspectives on drag cosplay or gender bending? I would love to hear it. I would love to see it. Tell me in the comments below. Tell me how you feel about everything, but be nice and kind, and I will delete any transphobic comments. As always, you can go and check out my other channel, Incidental Mythology, which is where I put up video essays to talk about mythology and popular culture in a much more intensive way. You can go to my website and check out my other books. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And Facebook. I think I've got a Facebook page. Anyway, go do all the social media stuff, go do all the YouTube stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!